Everybody, my name is Dr. Stacy Ybarra Evans, and I am the director of the Center for Teaching Excellence here at Our Lady of the Lake University, San Antonio. And in the last 72 hours, we've had headlines that have been dominated by Meta's new patent. It's an AI system that is designed to simulate your personality, your post, and your voice calls after you die. They call it preserving memories. I call it a failure of institutional consent. Go ahead. Next here. So we are told that AI is an inevitable force, but for my students here at Our Lady of Lake University, we are a Hispanic serving institution with 78% Hispanic enrollment, and AI is not just a tool, it is a new form of digital redlining. If we don't negotiate its limits right now, our students' data will be used to reanimate them for profit long after they've left our classrooms. So, to sound smart about the future, we have to prove that we can fix the past. In 2023, Our Lady of the Lake University was facing a 20% drop in Hispanic STEM enrollment, but we refused that narrative and that our students were not ready for STEM. By applying universal design for learning and experiential learning, we saw a 21% increase in Hispanic STEM retention, climbing from 55% to 76 in just 1 year. We didn't need more surveillance. We needed more better design. So to understand why we must refuse certain AI designs, we have to look at what happens when we successfully refuse a fading institutional narrative. At Our Lady of the Lake University, we serve the most affected people and areas. And in 2023, we were not just fighting software, we were fighting the 20% drop in Hispanic STEM enrollment. And we also had to refuse that these students were not ready for the rigor. Instead, we used UDL and experiential learning to redesign their entire environment. With the 21% increase in STEM retention, climbing from the 55 to 76, we proved that when you redesign for the margin, you don't just help students, you stabilize the entire institution. This data is my proof of concept, and it shows that refusing the status quo is the most generative act an educator can perform. So how do we move from automated exclusion to democratic negotiation? At the Center for Teaching Excellence here at Our Lady of the Lake University, we believe it starts by redefining the word refusal. Refusal is not just about logging off, it's a generative act that reshapes how technology is developed and deployed. So think about the headlines from just 4 days ago when Meta was granted the patent for the grief tech. This AI that simulates a deceased user's language and behavior patterns to keep their account active indefinitely. Meta calls it preserving memories. I call it digital afterlife without consent. And that's where Our Lady of the Lake's work becomes a model for resistance. We've already proved that refusal works. We refused the deficit narrative that said our Hispanic students were not ready for STEM. And by designing and redesigning the environment with UDL and seeing the increase for retention, we are teaching our faculty and our students to look at predictive advisors and say, I refuse to be a passive data point. And every time we say no to a tool that doesn't recognize our students' lived experiences, we create the essential friction required to demand a more just and participatory future. So as this shift from surveillance to assistive intelligence is at the heart of our current faculty development efforts, and we use technology to monitor, we are focusing on enhancement over judgment. And so by integrating UDL through our inclusive AI learning framework, we are making these tools equitable and providing multiple means of learning. Ultimately, this Title V grant that we received remains strictly human-centric and prioritizing these rights to ensure technology expands participation for those mostly affected. This framework for democratic negotiation bridges our Title V mission with the necessity of social justice in the digital age. And by grounding our UDL and social justice, we reframe technical accessibility as a fundamental participatory right for our students. This shift the focus from passive consumption to a fundamental participatory right for our students, and how the active negotiation of how AI is implemented in our classrooms, ensuring that faculty and students have a seat at the table. To maintain this accountability, we are auditing procurement and co-design processes, demanding transparency from the developers whose tools we bring into this ecosystem. Ultimately, these are scalable solutions, insights we are gathering here at the university that are designed to be translational, applying just as effectively as our partners at the community colleges and Ivy Leagues as they do broader global context. So this framework for reclaiming equitable participation is where our research at Ardeva Lake meets the urgent headlines for today. So an actual case study that mirrors the risk we're fighting against is in a recent analysis of predictive success models used across several universities. Researchers found that Black and Hispanic students were falsely predicted to fail at rates of 20 to 21%, nearly double the rate of their white peers. For a student being labeled high risk by an algorithm based on historical inequities, that's not just a data point. It's a barrier to scholarships, it's a barrier to specialized support. Our mission at the university with Title V grants is the refusal shown here, a refusal to let predictive tech become a new form of digital redlining. Through our faculty development and topic research, we are moving from passive consumption to an active negotiation of AI governance, and we are building a future where UDL, Universal Design for Learning, ensures that AI does not just predict a student's struggle, but instead provides the exact equitable tools that they need to overcome it. We are making sure that for every student, refusal is not is our negotiation and equity is our goal. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. And Maria is back. But since it's the two of you, I think it might be good to have a bit of a discussion about your presentation. So really interesting. I don't know if anyone has any questions. Maybe in the meantime, I was curious to know if you can share a bit more details on how the process. So is this with the students?
Yes.
Yeah. If you can share a bit more about how the process takes place, this kind of co-design and starting, I understand from refusal, so that there's a process of building together. If you wouldn't mind sharing a bit more how you do that.
Yes. Yes, so basically the people in the academic provost office applied for a Title V grant through the Department of Ed about 5 years ago. They received it about 3.5 years ago. As you know, maybe about less than a year ago, they cut all those grants. But before they cut the grants, the work began. So they created a makerspace. They created professional development for faculty in STEM for UDL. And they were also able to get faculty trained in different areas that help students in STEM. And so with that, they were able to do classroom observations and see that we didn't just need another AI tool, that it was more boots on the ground, faculty development, students saying, I don't want another tool telling me that I'm going to fail, but I'm going to go ahead and pass based on what I learned in this classroom. So as a Hispanic serving institution, as a minority, there's always a deficit narrative where like you're not good enough, or maybe you're not going to be successful. And so I feel that I was able to outlive that narrative because my parents were migrant farm workers from West Texas. They ended up moving and eloping to San Antonio, Texas, which is really far away from where they came from. And then they didn't expect to have me as a child, but when they had me, I was able to go to college all the way to my doctorate degree on a full scholarship because of the situations they had, their narrative. A lot of people don't get that money, and so we're trying to say, hey, just because the way you were shaped and the way you were raised, it should build a model for resistance, not and a persistence, not to stop going to school. So hopefully we help out with that.
Great. And at the university setting, how much is there any pressure to acquire tools? Because and sometimes you hear from educators that although they want to have this space for thinking first through, what is it that the students and the faculty want and need, and whether some tech solutions are the solution or not,
Yeah.
there's a lot of pressure and the need to just jump onto the hype so that there's there's this fear of losing out. Is this something you've encountered in your context?
Yes, ma'am. So we're currently, like I said, a Hispanic serving institution. So that means that we don't have a lot of money. Basically, we're a private institution. We've been around for a long, long time. We were the first Hispanic serving institution. So way back when we were made, the Sisters of Divine Providence, it's a Catholic school. They came here to specifically San Antonio to make sure people that were in this deep, poor south side, deep part, west side of San Antonio were able to get the education they needed, right? So over the last 2 years, we've encountered a lot of I say low, like high job cuts. So we had about 16 faculty get laid off last year because the programs that are we currently teaching in the school were not really having good like outcomes for students. And so we had to have a lot of faculty be dismissed from the university. We had a lot of program closures, but there was still that call from faculty and students and staff that they wanted specific technologies, right? The number one problems that faculty are facing specifically are policing students that are using AI on the campus. And so they want Turnitin. They want all these different apps that will help you find students cheating. But those things come at a high cost and they're not really effective. So what I found myself doing is I took a course through Caltech called AI Tools Everywhere, completely free. It's from 6 to 9 o'clock at night. I took it 3 times and I learned about Manus, Manus, and it's an AI tool that's agentic. So I learned how to develop my own website. I developed my own tool for faculty. And then, now it's being used by Clemson University. It's being used by South Dakota Xavier University, Hood University, and I've presented it on multiple times. It's called the AI Resistant Pedagogy Studio, and it's all over the internet. It's free. So if you Google it, you'll be able to pull up the tool. It's got a framework, and it's really good to help faculty members renegotiate their assignments by redesign versus blue books and stuff like that. Because students are using blue books again, and they're like, "What is this?" So I like that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Anyone else has any question or wants to chip in?
Stacy, was there anything that surprised you about your outcomes?
Was there anything about surprising with outcomes? I thought that they were going to be a lot lower because we only had several faculty participate in the faculty development, but because of the different things that they learned, they were able to incorporate it throughout the semester. And so it did bring up the outcomes a lot higher than I thought it was going to happen initially. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Great. So maybe since you also mentioned AI as surveillance, no, trying to survey the students, that's going to be a good segue to Maria's presentation. If you are ready, Maria, no worries about the camera if it's not working. Oh, it is. Okay, perfect. Um, which is taking us to Kenya to see an example of co-creating AI policy and practice in predictive policing. So over to you. Perfect. Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Maria Lungu, and I am part of the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. And so today I'm going to be examining Kenya as a case study in participatory AI governance. And so rather than us treating the Global South as this passive recipient of imported systems, I'm trying to analyze Kenya as this active place where there's contestation and there's negotiation that happens when policy is introduced. And I'm trying to ask whether and how Kenya would be the right domain for more co-creation and participatory policy making when it comes to predictive policing. And so why Kenya and why now? I think that Kenya is a timely and an important case because it reflects somewhere in Africa where there's so much AI-enabled surveillance and predictive analytics that are expanding and that are being used in something that's considered a more dynamic democracy on the continent. And I think over the past decade, at least, the surveillance infrastructure has really started to grow, and it's growing quite rapidly, especially in Nairobi, particularly under the Safe City initiative. And so there's this integration of more CCTV cameras and more fiber optic networks and centralized command centers. And most of this is being integrated, not just in the city, but in more urban policing areas. So at the same time, you have this surveillance and predictive policing. You have these questions that are emerging in the global north, in the US, in Europe, about the constitutionality of some of these systems, about democracy associated with questions of bias and transparency and accountability with these. And this is not just isolated to the global north. We're hearing this more from Kenyan civil society actors, because they're also questioning whether these imported analytical tools are sort of strengthening the existing inequalities particularly in the more informal settlements or in the more heavily policed neighborhoods. So again, Kenya isn't just this passive recipient. There's this robust civil society that's growing, and people are asking the right questions. And so I ask, what will this landscape look like in the next 5 to 10 years, where there's this push for more surveillance within Kenya? And so specifically, I'm looking at the Safe City initiative. I think it all begins here because this started in the mid-2010s about a concern about urban crime. And so the city was expanding their surveillance capabilities, and it was looked at this way of modernizing Kenya's landscape. But what is happening here is there's this unseen digital nervous system, as it's been described, that's linked to the safe city systems. And so a lot of critics call this the birth of the algorithmic state in Kenya in a new way. And it's evident that Kenya's system is more extensive than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. So civil rights groups such as Article 19, Eastern Africa, are warning that these same technologies that are purported to modernize systems and to make us feel safer aren't really meant to protect citizens, but it's really about watching individuals. And this is often without consent and transparency. So there's a lot of initiatives that have questioned the validity of these systems. And then, of course, there's the global partnerships that are taking place and these asymmetries that are happening. So when we think about the Safe City program, you connect this to Huawei. And so there's these foreign procurement agreements that are taking place. And, there's this emphasis on performance and efficiency. And there's less transparency about what these contracts look like. And so what happens is there's this structural imbalance that takes place. And while you may be importing a lot of these sophisticated surveillance tools, I don't necessarily think that the regulatory landscape has caught up to the extent at which these tools are developing in Kenya. And also what this connects to is the colonial landscape within Kenya. So we can't really separate AI in Kenya from its history. So we have your policing institutions that are evolved through colonial governments, these systems that emphasize control and monitoring. And really what we've done is we've transferred that control and monitor into some of these technologies, even if it seems more symbolic now than necessary. And so when AI-driven surveillance enters this environment, it doesn't just operate in this vacuum. We have to consider it with this historical layering that happens. And so what I do is I consider civil society as a governance actor in this debate, because civil society has two arguments against what these predictive policing technologies do. So you have on the top your spatial temporal predictions that civil society are saying leads to adverse outcomes, whether those are constitutional questions or whether it's questions of governance. There isn't anything in place that's keeping us safe from how these technologies are operating. And then, of course, you have your perceptions of what traditional policing are. So you have your profiling that's taking place, which is also leading to your adverse outcomes. And so this is sort of a no-win situation that's happening. And it's creating this co-created tension in Kenya between civil society, technology, and government. So there are institutional questions, there are organizational questions, and there's questions at the individual level that need to be addressed. And so that's why I'm wondering, how does a co-created technology policy operate within this context? So when I think about this, let me try and move this. When I think about what co-creation looks like, I think about early design decisions. And I follow that up with thinking about what the actual design of the instrumentality, what the oversight mechanisms need to be. And finally, this idea of iterative adjustment that needs to take place. So we think about the before, we think about what the public needs to constitute and contribute to the discussion. And when people feel like they are part of the discussion of whether or not they need these technologies, they ask questions about the black box nature of these technologies. This impacts the decisions that policymakers make about whether to introduce this or not. And there's a lot of research to suggest the like. Also, with the inclusion of more early stage intervention, you have more challenges to disclose what vendor contracts look like if there is a push to do so. But if those questions aren't asked at the beginning, it's much harder to ask what vendor agreements are like at the end when systems are already in place. Then one of the most important parts of this is the iterative adjustment. Countries and organizations don't always get this right the first time. So that means policy revision, going back to understanding what the observed disparities are, and being able to suspend programs, remodify, or in some instances, cancel them altogether. And it's necessary to have this co-creation system because this offers some legitimacy to these tools that are being used. We understand that technology is developing and growing, and there's this extensive push, but we want to understand why these technologies are introduced, how are we keeping civil society safe, how are we addressing issues of bias and the like. We want to understand the epistemic accuracy of these tools because they're usually incorporated in risk environments. So we want to understand how the analytics are developed and then what they constitute when we analyze their outcomes. All of this mitigates the risk that is associated with these tools. And this is all leading us to the question of how we achieve democratic accountability. It's all these questions about how a co-created nature creates a system where everybody feels a part of the decision-making process. Thank you.
Fantastic. Did you want to? Okay, I just saw a slide, so I was not sure if you wanted to go through that too. Fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting ideas that resonate with what also we've been hearing, but from the specific lens of Kenya, which is really, really helpful and insightful. We've been hearing throughout the day in terms of the challenges for early on democratic and co-created governance of these tools and how they are applied. I'll stop to see if anyone has a question. Otherwise, I have some as well.
Yeah, Maria put it in the chat. You argued that participation builds legitimacy in communities historically over policed by colonial area systems. What specific strategies are you used to rebuild the trust necessary for this kind of early stage inclusion, in your opinion?
So I've actually been doing some research with police chiefs about this. And really what they say is if the first time you're speaking to your community is when you're introducing the technology, you've really lost the game at that point because people want to feel included in the decisions leading up. So some of the strategies to do that, you need to understand the communities in which you operate. You need to understand the context in which these technologies are being introduced. Some people don't care about these technologies in that community if they don't have access to clean water, if they don't have access to safe communities. There are certain things that communities care about. So when you're introducing technologies, I think you have to do a clear assessment of what the needs within the community are. Assess that with a balancing act of what that means for public safety, et cetera. So I think at that early stage, you definitely want to understand the problem that you're seeking to solve and make sure that that problem actually exists within that community.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Great,
Yeah,
Genevieve.
thank you. Thanks so much. I guess like something that I'm thinking about is curious in your thoughts here, and I think it connects a bit with the first presentation too, but I guess I'm just thinking about like the premise of, participatory co-creation in the context of like predictive policing and surveillance, which, kind of goes, my first thought is does like working with police chiefs around this, like getting community input on something like surveillance and predictive policing, like maybe refusal is more of the approach. And so I guess I'm just wondering if there's like a tension here around like using participatory processes in spaces
Yeah.
like predictive policing surveillance, where maybe that like isn't something that actually, would benefit many marginalized groups.
Mm-hmm.
And is that potentially then using processes that like legitimize things that maybe shouldn't exist in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a valid argument, and it's one we brought up with organizations and with policing agencies as well. So you'll have a group of individuals who value what these technologies do. You'll also have those who will never have a trust of of what community policing can look like. Those you're likely never going to change the minds of those who have adverse relationships with police officers, and those are usually marginalized communities. And we accept the history of what those relationships looks like and why they occur. So whether you're legitimizing something that maybe some communities are adverse to, unfortunately, the way it stands right now is these technologies do exist, right? They are being introduced. In some instances, they are 25% of police agencies' budgets. But what we don't know is what the contracts look like connected to these. We don't know why they're introduced in certain communities. There are lots of questions at the early stage where communities are left out of this discussion and left to sort of feel the effects of the technology at the end, at the back end of things. And so I'm not here to convince people to accept surveillance or accept predictive policing as it stands. What I am doing is I'm saying if it's here right now, what you can either advocate against it, which is a valid thing, and there's groups that will continue to do that, or if this technology is going to remain, what do the systems look like when it comes to AI adoption? So it's really it's an either, there are different camps, there are different schools of thought when it comes to it, and I can't sort of negotiate that. People will feel how they feel about technology. But I definitely understand the tension that exists, and it still does.
Maybe to add to that, because that's a question I had, especially from the side of civil society in Kenya,
Mhm.
how much the work or the way they are engaging with the issue is mainly through refusal and contestation and, bottom-up activism versus asking for these spaces of maybe these governance mechanisms of, early engagement and procurement and transparency.
Yeah, that's definitely, and it's connected to Genevieve's question. There is that fight. There is, for example, here in the US, you'll have the ACLU who will always advocate against increased surveillance and these predictive technologies. But we also have to understand that we're sort of speaking about predictive policing in a vacuum. There are different types, and they're different. Not everything is sort of, I don't want to get into the details of each type, but you have person-based, you have place-based, you have network policing, you have event-based predictions. There are different types of predictions that police officers are using. Not all of them lead to adverse outcomes. Some of them are just about reallocating resources. In fact, there's some research to suggest once these predictions are made, they do not send police officers to some of these areas. They'll send people like violence interrupters, they'll send social workers, they'll send alternative measures to these areas in order to conduct analyses before police are involved. So there are different ways that these are being adjusted for in the light of all of this conflict against technology within police agencies.
Just checking if anyone else has another question. I have another one, but I'll pause in case anyone has.
For me.
Okay, I'll ask the other one then, and which is, so you talked about the value of early involvement, which is again a topic that comes up in this conference and in research on the use of AI in public services. What do you think needs to, maybe let me ask a different way. What might be the best way or the best strategy for governments and departments of governments or the police chiefs to do that, to design the way they work so that there can be this early involvement?
Yeah, so I think first it means inclusion before deployment, not after a controversy, which is just not the way that it's operating right now. Right now, we hear about these technologies and surveillance when something happens or there's a lawsuit or anything of the such. But what it really looks like is possibly more structured public consultations before even the procurement decisions are finalized or are made. People need to understand where their tax dollars are going, and there's I think more engagement with some of these digital rights groups during the system design, asking questions about what data is used to create these models, like asking questions about the black box nature of these instrumentalities. I think co-creation sort of shifts what participation looks like. We need a better understanding of how to reach democratic accountability. And I think we can't just say, we don't want any parts of it. Well, this is how I see it. If we don't have any parts of it, but it is still occurring and it's still happening, I think that's to our detriment if we're not a part of these discussions and we don't ask for transparency and accountability from the start. And I think that's where the shift is happening, particularly in Kenya, because you have these digital rights groups that are saying, "Hey, we don't want this." Why are we only hearing about these technologies once they're a part of our communities? We don't even understand the necessity for them. It might be different if they had been part of the co-created design of these. It might not. We don't know for sure, but it is a strategy that I think governance needs to consider, at least, at the very least.
For sure. I guess my question was, how ready do you think the government is to take that
Yeah.
approach? Like, do you see it happening anytime soon that the government process will change to enable that early engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess that would be a question for those who work, who are part of the system, right?
Yeah.
We can only operate from our end and ask questions from our end about what transparency looks like. The readiness of the government, I think that'll depend and that'll be context specific. And then there's also the question of how much can the government tell us, right? When they use these technologies, there's this idea that they're doing this for public safety, so how much can they really tell the public when it comes to these same systems? So it's sort of like telling the people who it will be, who it's sort of like giving away national security and public safety secrets. There's also that argument as well. So in terms of readiness, who knows when they would be ready? But I think in situations when it comes to public safety, you sort of have to force the hand of policymakers and put tension into the system and demand, transparency measures.
So we go back to the contestation, and the
Yeah.
bottom-up activism. I've seen Genevieve, you have your hand up, so handing over to you.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if I feel convinced that I guess like when I think about participatory design and think about co-creation and the theoretical underpinnings of participatory design and their ties to different, spaces like feminist STS, et cetera, it's all about power. And I think in the context of policing, there's already an inherent power dynamic where the police have the power. And so, sure, there may be opportunities to get their opinions on things like where should cameras be for surveillance and things like that. And you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, that Kenya is increasingly like police state and that there are these like incentive structures that seem to exist at kind of these like higher levels. And so I guess I would just push back again a little bit around whether participatory design and like true co-creation is possible in places like policing, especially in environments where like police states are increasing. And of course, you know, my positionality being in the United States and thinking about the tensions that exist with like policing and ICE and surveillance, you know, I think that like if ICE was using participatory design or something for like, you know, we're seeing increased surveillance with AI, especially against like immigrant communities. It's like, I just don't know. I think that's still like kind of inherently at odds with the theory underpinning participatory design and co-creation. So I don't know. I guess maybe just like debate purposes, like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I saw you come off mute.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you, Genevieve. So this would never be something that is connected to ICE as an example. I know that that's sort of a extreme example, but I will give Charlottesville as an example where participatory and co-creation has taken place. So I'm also thinking about this from a U.S. perspective. I'm here in Virginia. When flock cameras were introduced in Charlottesville. They did take on a participatory design scheme because the police chief was so convinced that he needed to give power to the community to make decisions about what these cameras would look like. This was also introduced when they were including license plate readers in elementary school zones just to start to be able to assess who is speeding in school zones, etc. There was a lot of iterative back and forth between community members to decide how this would be implemented, whether it was needed or not. And what happened, if I remember correctly from what the police chief said, is the reason that they were able to get some sort of concessions with regards to data protection, privacy, with regards to how many cameras were used or the locations of these cameras, questions about whether they were in over-policed areas. The reason that they were able to make a lot of those changes was a result of those public consultations and that iterative back and forth with community members. So there are instances where it's necessary to get the feedback from the community to understand what your community needs and wants. So there isn't this blanket assessment of what policing is and how individuals are interacting with police officers. There is some type of power being given back to communities. Now, does this happen everywhere and in every instance? No, that we understand the nature of the criminal justice system. But there are instances where that co-create participatory design and offering is working for the better of the community. And yes, there is an asymmetrical power structure at place. It's also there in Kenya in terms of colonial manifestations. It exists, yes. But I guess I understand both sides, having worked in public defense and understanding how criminal the tensions within the criminal justice system, but also sort of feeling hopeful that there's a way we can give some power back to communities to have them ask questions about the technologies that are being introduced, often silently. So that's
Okay.
Yeah, and
that's where I see it. Yeah.
that makes sense. And I agree that, you know, not every police force is the same and there's different incentives and things like that. And so I guess it seems to be like part of this in my mind would depend on what are the incentive structures that exist within police forces in different areas, and are they
Mhm.
truly incentivized to make sure that all community members are protected and safe versus, you know, many and in a surveillance state or increasing surveillance state, to what
Yeah.
extent is that possible or not? And
Yeah.
yeah, anyways, those are just some thoughts, but
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for
I'm
that. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Anna.
I'm so sorry because the plenary session is starting now. So I really need to wrap up the session because I think both Matt and I might have to attend as well. So I hope that's okay.
oh
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah, of
thank you
course.
so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Thank you
but
very
Thanks so
much.
much. Bye.
thank you.